Wright Field, Ohio, November 1942. The teletype machine chattered in the corner of the Materials Command Office, spitting out another requisition for P-40 Warhawks. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock stood by the window, watching mechanics crawl over a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt on the frozen tarmac below. The big fighter squatted there like a pregnant bull, all bulk and promise, destined for production lines that would churn out thousands. Behind him, a wall covered in procurement charts told a story written in bureaucratic ink. 2,500 P-40s on order, 8,800 Bell P-39 Air Cobras, a staggering 11,000 P-63 King Cobras. None of them could touch a Focke-Wulf 190 above 20,000 feet. Hitchcock turned from the window, his jaw tight. At 42, he carried himself with the lean, coiled energy of a man who jumped from a moving prisoner train at 18 and walked 100 miles through German-occupied territory to Switzerland. The polo fields of Long Island and the investment banking towers of Manhattan felt like someone else's life now. The only thing that mattered was the file folder in his hand. Edges worn from repeated handling, stamped with a designation that meant nothing to anyone at Wright Field. NA-73, the Mustang. Sired by the English out of an American mother, he'd written in his latest report to Washington. The Mustang has no parent in the Army Air Corps to appreciate and push its good points. It was a peculiar orphan, this plane. Born from British desperation in April 1940 when the Royal Air Force needed fighters, and needed them yesterday. The British Purchasing Commission had approached North American aviation with a straightforward proposition. Build us Curtiss P-40s under license. Fast, proven, adequate. James H. Dutch Kindleberger, North American's president, had taken one look at the P-40 blueprints and turned to his chief designer with a question that would echo through history. Ed, do we want to build P-40s here? Edgar Schmued, a self-taught Austrian immigrant who'd learned aerodynamics in German workshops and Brazilian hangars, had been waiting for exactly this question his entire career. His answer came without hesitation. Well, Dutch, don't let us build an obsolete airplane. Let's build a new one. What followed was either genius or madness, depending on whom you asked at Wright Field. Schmued's team completed the design drawings in 102 days. The prototype, designated NA-73X, first flew on October 26, 1940. It was sleek, where contemporary fighters were blunt, streamlined, where others were boxy. The wing, shaped according to new laminar flow theories from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, promising drag reduction that sounded too good to be true, and it was too good, at least in theory. Dust, bugs, rivets, paint all conspired to disrupt the smooth airflow that laminar theory demanded. But what Edgar Schmued and his team didn't fully realize at the time, what no one would understand until pilots pushed the Mustang to its limits, was that the laminar flow wing had given them something better than low drag. By pure serendipity, that particular airfoil shape delayed the onset of transonic effects. The Mustang could fly closer to the speed of sound than any fighter of its generation before drag rose catastrophically. It was an accidental advantage, invisible in wind tunnels, invaluable in combat. The British loved it. The RAF snapped up the first production run, designated them Mustang Maquis, and put them to work in tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles. Low and fast, the Mustang could photograph German positions, strafe trains, and dance away from trouble. At altitudes below 15,000 feet, it was magnificent. Above that height, the Allison V-1710 engine gasped like a drowning man. Hitchcock had seen this limitation in British test reports. He'd watched RAF pilots shake their heads as they described how the Mustang simply ran out of breath. When German fighters climbed above the clouds, the supercharger on the Allison was single-stage, adequate for low-level work, pathetic at bomber altitudes. And bomber altitudes were where the war would be won or lost. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force flew their missions at 25,000 feet and higher, sailing into Germany's industrial heartland, while German fighters rose to meet them like sharks sensing blood. The escorts, Spitfires, P-47s, even the twin-engine P-38 Lightnings could only follow so far before their fuel ran out, and they had to turn for home. Then the massacre began. Hitchcock had read the mission reports. He'd seen the numbers. August 17th, 1943, 60 B-17s lost in a single day attacking Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The crews called it Black Thursday in advance, and they were right. The odds of an American bomber crewman surviving a 25-mission tour had dropped to 1 in 4. Young men climbed into fortresses knowing, mathematically, they would not come home. The answer was right there in Hitchcock's file folder. In April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker had flown a Mustang and immediately understood what everyone else had missed. The airframe was extraordinary. The engine was wrong. Harker flew back to Hucknall and went straight to his superiors with an idea that sounded absurd. Take Britain's precious Merlin engine, the power plant that made Spitfires soar and Lancasters thunder, and stuff it into an American fighter. By October 1942, 5 Mustangs had been converted to Merlin 65 engines in Britain. The results weren't just good, they were staggering. At 30,000 feet, the Merlin-powered Mustang hit 430 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version at that altitude. The 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger designed by Stanley Hooker breathed life into the high-altitude performance. Suddenly, the Mustang wasn't just a low-level racer. It was a high-altitude predator. Hitchcock had hammered this information into every report he sent from London to Washington. He'd called in favors, hosted dinner parties with influential friends, buttonholed anyone who would listen. Robert Lovett, the Undersecretary of War and an old friend from the Great War, understood immediately. Lovett had flown British planes in 1918. He knew quality when he saw it, regardless of the flag painted on the fuselage. But at Wright Field, the resistance was granite solid. American fighters should have American engines. The Packard Motor Company might be building Merlins under license in Detroit, but that didn't change the fundamental sin. This was a British engine in an American plane that had been designed for the British in the first place. The procurement officers had their favorites, their relationships, their existing contracts with established manufacturers, Bell, Curtiss, Republic. Those companies had friends in the Pentagon. North American was an upstart, better known for trainers and medium bombers than fighters. There was something else, too, something Hitchcock could feel but couldn't prove. Politics, connections, money. The established manufacturers had clout, and clout translated into contracts. Why risk the known quantity for an unknown hybrid, no matter how promising the test data looked? General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had reluctantly approved an order for 2,200 P-51Bs in late 1942 after Lovett's intervention. But approval on paper and actual production were different beasts. The order sat, gathering bureaucratic dust, while production lines continued churning out P-40s that couldn't compete with German fighters and P-39s that pilots privately called flying coffins. Hitchcock folded the file and tucked it under his arm. The teletype machine had gone quiet. Outside the window, the December sky hung low and gray, promising snow. He thought about the bomber crews in England, boys from Iowa and Texas and New York, climbing into their forts for another mission into Germany's heart. He thought about the fighters that would escort them to the Dutch coast, maybe to the German border if they were lucky, before fuel gauges forced them to turn back and leave the bombers naked in the sky. He thought about Edgar Schmued in California, an immigrant engineer who'd built a masterpiece and watched it be ignored by his adopted country. He thought about Ronald Harker in England, a test pilot who'd seen a solution and wouldn't let it die. He thought about assembly lines in Detroit that could be building Merlin engines by the thousands, marrying British precision to American mass production, if only someone would sign the right papers. Somewhere over Germany, at this very moment, a B-17 was burning. 10 men inside. Some would bail out, parachutes blossoming white against dark clouds, drifting down into captivity, or worse, some wouldn't get out at all. The statistics were clear. At the current loss rates, the entire daylight bombing campaign would collapse within months. The invasion of Europe, planned for next summer, would fail before it began if the Allies didn't own the sky. The Mustang could change that. The Merlin-powered Mustang, with its speed and range and high-altitude performance, could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It could turn the air war from a grinding war of attrition into something winnable. But first it had to overcome something far more dangerous than German fighters. It had to overcome bureaucracy. Hitchcock walked out of the Materials Command Office and headed for the Communications Center. He had calls to make, strings to pull, favors to call in. The word channels, as his biographer would later note, was an utterance he sometimes could not hear well. Neither could he hear the word no. The orphan plane needed a champion, and Thomas Hitchcock had never walked away from a fight. Not when German soldiers guarded the train he jumped from. Not when 10-goal polo matches hung in the balance. Not when the future of the air war, and perhaps the entire European campaign, depended on a hybrid fighter that existed in only a handful of prototypes and test reports. In California, Edgar Schmued worked late at his drafting table, refining the design of the P-51B, incorporating the Packard Merlin, calculating range with drop tanks, sketching improvements. In Detroit, Packard engineers calibrated assembly lines, preparing to mass-produce an engine designed in Derby, England, adapted for American manufacturing tolerances. In England, bomber crews slept fitfully before dawn missions, and fighter pilots studied maps, calculating exactly how far they could fly before the fuel warning lights began to glow. The pieces were all there. The technology was proven. The need was desperate. All that remained was for the machine of war production to overcome the inertia of made-in-America pride and recognize a simple truth. The best fighter for American bombers wore a British heart inside an American body. By the time Hitchcock's messages reached Washington, snow had begun to fall over Wright Field, covering the P-47 on the tarmac in a white shroud. Spring would bring new production schedules if he succeeded. Spring would bring the P-51B off the assembly lines in meaningful numbers if he could break through the resistance. Spring would bring young pilots checking out in Mustangs, learning to trust a fighter that looked too delicate, too refined, too fast to be real. And if Hitchcock failed, spring would bring more funerals, more Gold Star mothers, more empty chairs at mess tables in English airfields, more burning B-17s falling from German skies. The orphan plane waited. Its champion had work to do. Inglewood, California. The drafting table in Edgar Schmued's office bore the scars of 1,000 erased calculations. Pencil shavings accumulated in the tray beneath the angled surface testimony. To nights that blurred into mornings, problems that demanded solutions, and physics that occasionally refused to cooperate. At 41 years old, Schmued had learned that great aircraft weren't conjured from inspiration alone. They emerged from the grinding intersection of mathematics, materials, and manufacturing reality. He'd been sketching fighters in spare moments for years. Every engineer worth his slide rule kept a notebook of ideas, concepts that might work if the stars aligned and someone foolish enough to gamble on them came along, but sketches were easy. Building a fighter in 102 days? That wasn't engineering. That was a wager against probability itself. Ed, do we want to build P-40s here? Question had come from Dutch Kindleberger 2 months ago, casual as asking about lunch plans. But Schmued had heard the subtext. The British needed fighters. Curtis was at capacity. North American aviation could take the safe path, accept a licensed production contract, build someone else's design, collect the money, or they could risk everything. Schmued's answer had required exactly 0 seconds of deliberation. Well, Dutch, don't let us build an obsolete airplane. Let's build a new one. The room had gone quiet. Lee Atwood, the vice president, had stopped mid-stride. Raymond Rice, chief engineer, had looked up from his calculations. Everyone understood what Schmued was proposing: reject a guaranteed contract to design something from scratch in the same time frame it would take to tool up for P-40 production. It was either genius or career suicide, possibly both. But Kindleberger had smiled. He'd come to North American from Douglas, where he'd worked on the DC series transports that were revolutionizing commercial aviation. He understood that sometimes the biggest risk was playing it safe. How long? 120 days to first flight, Schmued had said, if we start now. That conversation felt like a lifetime ago, though the calendar disagreed. May 4th, 1940, the British Purchasing Commission signed the contract for the NA-73 prototype. April 29th, they'd agreed to pay for wind tunnel data from Curtiss. On the failed XP-46 project, $56,000 for information that arrived too late to matter because Schmued had already finished the preliminary design. May 23rd, official contract for 320 production aircraft, even though the prototype existed only in drawings. The British were desperate. France was collapsing. The RAF was bleeding. Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than factories could replace them. If Hitler crossed the Channel, the war was over. The British needed fighters, needed them now, and were willing to bet on an American company that had never built a fighter before. Schmued rolled up his sleeves and went to work. The design team had assembled quickly. Edward Horkey, chief aerodynamicist, brought expertise in airflow that bordered on mystical. He could see turbulence in his mind, the way composers heard symphonies. Raymond Rice anchored the practical engineering, ensuring that Schmued's vision could actually be manufactured. Larry Waite handled technical details. Art Chester, who'd built racing planes that pushed piston engines to their screaming limits, took power plant integration. Kenneth Bowen and George Gherkins managed projects, coordinating between departments. As drawings evolved into metal, they worked 6.5 days a week, late into each night, going home early on Sundays at 6 in the evening. 78,000 man-hours would be consumed before the prototype rolled out. The math was brutal. Roughly 12 hours per day, 7 days a week for 14 weeks, across a team that swelled to include draftsmen, engineers, and designers. The wing was Schmued's obsession, not just any wing, a laminar flow wing based on new research from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The theory was elegant. Shape the airfoil so the thickest point moved aft, creating smooth airflow over more of the wing surface. Turbulent flow created drag. Laminar flow reduced it. On paper, the gains were spectacular, 25 to 50% drag reduction. In practice, it was temperamental as a thoroughbred. Surface imperfections, rivets, panel joints, paint, even accumulated bugs could trip the airflow from laminar to turbulent. But Schmued saw something else in those NACA charts. The laminar flow shape, with its thickness moved rearward, also delayed transonic effects. At high speeds approaching Mach 1, normal wings generated shock waves that skyrocketed drag. The laminar airfoil postponed that crisis. Even if perfect laminar flow proved impossible to maintain, the wing would still slice through air at speeds that would make contemporary fighters choke. Wind tunnel tests at the University of Washington confirmed it. They'd tested 2 wings side by side, one using traditional NACA 5-digit airfoils, the other using the new NACA 45-100 series. The laminar design dominated. The fuselage came next. Schmued employed a technique unusual for aircraft, mathematical lofting using conic sections. Instead of eyeballing curves and hoping for the best, he defined the fuselage shape with precise geometric formulas, cones, cylinders, mathematical intersections. The result was a body that flowed, smooth and low drag, like liquid frozen in flight. To a casual observer, it looked delicate, almost fragile. To an engineer's eye, it was a masterpiece of intentional design. Every choice served production. The airframe divided into 5 main sections: forward fuselage, center section, rear fuselage, and 2 wing halves. Each section could be fitted with wiring and plumbing independently, then mated together. Mass production demanded modularity. You couldn't handcraft each airframe like a jeweler making watches. You needed to build hundreds, then thousands, and build them fast. The radiator placement was pure inspiration borrowed from frustration. Conventional thinking tucked radiators up front or in the wings, creating drag. Schmued positioned a single ducted assembly aft beneath the fuselage. Air entered through an intake, passed through coolant radiators, and exhausted out the back. The heated air, and here was the clever part, exited with velocity, creating a tiny bit of thrust, the Meredith effect, named after British researcher Frederick Meredith. It wouldn't overcome all cooling drag, but it would reduce the penalty significantly. The California Institute of Technology wind tunnel at Galsit confirmed the aerodynamics. The streamlined shape, the radiator placement, the wing, all of it worked together. The NA-73 would be fast. The question was, how fast? September 9th, 1940, 102 days after contract signing, the prototype rolled out of the factory. Edgar Schmued stood in the hangar doorway, watching sunlight gleam off bare aluminum. The NA-73X sat on its landing gear, sleek and purposeful, looking ready to leap into the sky, except it had no engine. The Allison V-1710 was delayed, still somewhere in transit. So they fitted dummy exhaust stacks and photographed it anyway. Documentation mattered. Proof of progress mattered. The British were paying for a fighter, and here was a fighter-shaped object, waiting only for its heart. The wing caught Schmued's attention, as it always did. Trapezoidal planform, squared-off tips that wind tunnel tests showed had fractionally less drag than rounded tips. Straight leading and trailing edges for manufacturing simplicity. You could stack straight edges in a factory jig. You could train workers to rivet straight lines. The elliptical wing the British loved on their Spitfires was aerodynamically ideal, sure, but it was a nightmare to build. Every rib was different, every angle unique, beautiful and expensive. The Mustang wing was beautiful because it was simple. Schmued walked a slow circle around the prototype. His wife Louisa wasn't here to see it. She died in a car crash on Route 60 while they were relocating from the East Coast back when Schmued worked for Belanca. He'd been seriously injured in the same accident. That was 5 years ago now, but grief had a way of marking time differently. She would have appreciated this moment. She'd understood his obsession with flight, the way some men were drawn to altitude and speed and the problem-solving beauty of making metal fly. "It's smaller than I expected," said Lee Atwood, walking up beside him. "Tight packaging," Schmued replied. "Every pound that isn't fuel or ammunition is wasted weight. The Allison V-1710 is compact. The laminar wing is thin. We put 180 gallons of fuel in the wing's self-sealing tanks, twice what a Spitfire carries. Range? We'll see. On paper, considerably more than anything the British have now." Test pilot Vance Breese arrived on October 26th after the Allison engine finally showed up and was installed. The V-1710-39, liquid-cooled 12 cylinders in a 60-degree V configuration capable of 1,150 horsepower. Not the most powerful engine available, but proven and available. Availability mattered. The best engine on a drawing board was worthless compared to a good engine you could actually install. Breese was a freelance test pilot, hired specifically because he wasn't a North American employee. If something went wrong, the company wanted plausible deniability. He climbed into the cockpit at first light, ran through pre-flight checks, and lifted the NA-73X off the runway at Mines Field. The first flight lasted just over an hour. When Breese taxied back, his grin said everything before he shut down the engine. "It flies like a dream," he reported to Schmued and Kindleberger. "Responsive, solid, fast. Jesus, it's fast. Climbs well. I need more time to push it, but this thing has legs." They gave him more time. Breese made 7 flights over the next few weeks, each one exploring more the envelope. Speed, climb rate, stall characteristics, roll response. Every test pilot has opinions, and Breese's opinion was clear. The NA-73 was a winner. Then came November 20th. Paul Baird Balfour, North American's chief test pilot, was scheduled to fly a high-speed test. Edgar Schmued offered to walk him through the aircraft systems. Balfour, confident with thousands of hours across dozens of aircraft types, waved it off. "One airplane is like another," he said. "I don't need the routine checkout." Schmued felt a cold prickle, but said nothing. Balfour was chief test pilot. You didn't question the chief test pilot's judgment in front of the crew. The Allison started hard that morning. Olaf Anderson, the mechanic, noted it was a little hard to start. They got it running, let it warm to operating temperature, shut it down, then restarted it before Balfour's flight. Everything looked normal. Balfour took off at 7:10 a.m. 12 minutes later, the engine quit. Balfour tried to restart, failed. He put the NA-73X into a glide, looking for a place to set down. Options were limited. Buildings, roads, fences. He picked a plowed field and committed to a dead-stick landing. The nose gear collapsed on touchdown. The aircraft flipped inverted, tearing through soft earth before coming to rest upside down. Rescue crews pulled Balfour out with a broken back. He'd survive, barely. The NA-73X would not. The prototype that took 102 days to design and build was destroyed in 12 minutes. Standing in the wreckage field, Schmued examined the engine. The problem revealed itself quickly: fuel starvation. A simple issue with fuel system priming after the engine had been shut down, warm, and restarted. Not a design flaw, an operational oversight, fixable with revised procedures, but the prototype was gone. 2 months of work. 78,000 man-hours, Britain's desperate need, the contract for 320 production aircraft. Everything rode on an airplane that now existed only as twisted metal in a farmer's field. Kindleberger stood beside Schmued, both men silent for a long moment. Then the president said, "The second aircraft is 90% complete. We'll finish it. We'll fly it. We'll prove this design works." Schmued nodded. The gamble hadn't ended. It had merely gotten more expensive. The second aircraft, the first actual production Mustang McFarland, flew on April 23, 1941, 6 months after the prototype's first flight. 6 months of refinement, fixes, improvements. The laminar wing got a coating, red Bondo-like paste applied to the leading third of the wing cord to fill imperfections and smooth the surface. Factory workers learned quickly that perfection was impossible. The wing worked anyway. By October 1941, the first Mustangs arrived in Liverpool. The RAF began combat operations in April 1942, using them for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack. Pilots loved them. At low altitude, the Mustang was faster than a Spitfire, more maneuverable than a Hurricane, and had double the range of either. But above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. Supercharger limitations. Physics. The bomber altitudes where the war was being decided remained out of reach. In Inglewood, Schmued sat at his drafting table designing improvements, the P-51A variant. The A-36 dive bomber version. Each iteration refined the basic design, but none solved the fundamental problem. The engine couldn't breathe at altitude. The solution existed. Schmued knew it existed. The British knew it existed. Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker had flown a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized what needed to happen. Put a Merlin engine, the two-stage supercharged Merlin that powered high-altitude Spitfires, into the Mustang airframe, matched the best American airframe with the best British engine. But that required cooperation between allies who didn't always cooperate smoothly. It required manufacturing licenses, contracts, approvals from bureaucrats on both sides of the Atlantic. It required someone willing to champion an orphan airplane that had no parent at right field. Schmued couldn't make those decisions. He was an engineer. His job was to design aircraft. The politics, the procurement, the convincing, that fell to others. But as he refined drawings for what would become the P-51B, incorporating space for the larger Merlin engine and its intercooler, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The bet he'd made, rejecting the safe P-40 contract to design something new in 102 days, had paid off. The Mustang existed, it flew, it fought. Now it just needed the right heart, and someone with enough stubbornness to force that heart transplant through channels that preferred American engines and American planes, regardless of which combination would actually win the war. Edgar Schmued bent over his drafting table and kept working. The Orphan needed a champion in Washington and London, but the Orphan also needed an engineer who understood that great aircraft were built one careful decision at a time, one calculation at a time, one line on a blueprint at a time. Somewhere over England, a Mustang McFarland screamed across the French coast at treetop level, photographing German defenses. The pilot pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Allison surge, knowing he had to stay low where the engine performed. Above 15,000 feet was enemy territory in more ways than one. The solution was so close. The airframe was right. The engine was wrong. And somewhere in the machinery of war, people who'd never flown a Mustang were deciding whether to fix that problem or ignore it. Schmued erased a line, redrew it with microscopic precision, and continued the work that only an engineer could do. Build it right. Build it to last. Build it so that when the right engine finally arrived, the airframe would be ready. The bet was made. The dice were still rolling. Hucknall, England. The telephone on Ronald Harker's desk rang at precisely the wrong moment. He was elbow deep in performance reports for the latest Spitfire 9 variant, trying to reconcile wind tunnel predictions with actual flight data, when Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord's voice crackled through the line from Duxford. "Ronnie, we've got something rather interesting here. American fighter, North American Mustang, Allison engine. The brass wants it evaluated before we decide what to do with the bloody thing. Fancy a trip down?" Harker glanced at the stack of paperwork on his desk, then at the gray April sky visible through his office window at the Rolls-Royce flight test establishment. 33 years old, senior liaison test pilot, he'd spent the last 3 years of war shuttling between RAF operational units and Rolls-Royce engineering, translating pilot complaints into engineering solutions. It was bridge-building work, essential but unglamorous. "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning, if you can manage it. Weather's supposed to be decent." The Mustang Madawam sat on the hard stand at Duxford like an exile from a different design philosophy. Harker circled it slowly, noting the clean lines, the laminar wing, the low-mounted radiator. American manufacture was evident in the flush riveting, the tight panel gaps, the overall impression of mass production precision. British fighters bore the marks of hand finishing and craftsman attention. The Mustang looked like it had been assembled by watchmakers with production quotas. Campbell Ord appeared beside him, smoking a cigarette. "Handles beautifully at low altitude, fast as anything we've got, but take it above 18,000 feet and it goes to sleep. That's the puzzle. Aerodynamically, it should be brilliant all the way up, but it isn't." Harker knelt to examine the engine cowling. The Allison V1710 installation was neat, professional, optimized for frontal area, single-stage supercharger. He could see the problem already, written in the engineering compromises of an engine designed for different priorities. "Mind if I take her up? That's why you're here." The cockpit felt different from a Spitfire, more American somehow. Instruments laid out with geometric precision, switches and levers where logic suggested they should be rather than where tradition dictated. Harker strapped in, ran through the start procedure, and felt the Allison come to life with a deep, authoritative rumble. Taxi, run up, everything normal. He advanced the throttle, and the Mustang accelerated down Duxford's runway with eager authority. Rotation came smoothly. Gear up, climb power. The altimeter began unwinding in reverse. At 5,000 feet, the Mustang was magnificent. Harker rolled into a series of clearing turns, feeling the controls, light, responsive, no vices. He pulled into a climb, then a dive, testing speed response. The aircraft felt alive in his hands, eager to do whatever he asked. He tried a few aerobatic maneuvers, loops, rolls, a lazy barrel roll that demonstrated the Mustang's surprising agility for a fighter this size. At 10,000 feet, still excellent. Faster than a Spitfire V at this altitude. Considerably faster. The airspeed indicator crept past numbers that would make a hurricane pilot envious. 15,000 feet. Still good. Strong. The engine sang with confidence. 18,000 feet, and there it was, the hesitation. Harker pushed the throttle to the stop and felt the engine labor. The supercharger was giving everything it had, but physics was physics. Single-stage supercharging could only compress intake air so much. Above this altitude, the Allison was operating on borrowed time, each 1,000 feet higher, reducing available power. 20,000 feet, the Mustang's performance had transformed from thoroughbred to cart horse. Climb rate degraded, acceleration sluggish. In combat at this altitude against Messerschmitt 109s or Focke-Wulf 190s with engines that breathed properly in thin air, the Mustang would be victim, not victor. Harker pushed higher, documenting the progressive performance loss, 25,000 feet. The cockpit was cold despite his heated suit. The aircraft still flew, but without enthusiasm. Every control input felt like pushing through molasses. The brilliant low-altitude fighter had become a mediocrity. He dropped back down to 10,000 feet and threw the Mustang through a combat-style engagement profile. Hard turns, violent reversals simulated gun tracking. The difference was night and day. At this altitude, the Mustang would demolish anything Germany fielded. The problem wasn't the airframe. The problem was the engine's inability to exploit that airframe's potential where the war was actually being fought. Harker landed after 30 minutes aloft, shut down, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment thinking. The technical solution was obvious to anyone who understood both power plants and airframes. The political solution was less obvious. Rolls-Royce's entire Merlin production was allocated. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters, Mosquitoes. The production schedules were set in stone, or at least in Air Ministry memoranda, which amounted to the same thing. But this airframe, this beautiful, fast, long-ranged airframe, was being wasted on an engine that handicapped it precisely where it needed to excel. He found Campbell Ord in the operations building. It's brilliant below 15,000. Above that, it's mediocre. The airframe is superb. The engine is the limiting factor. Can it be fixed? Not with the Allison. Not unless they redesign the entire supercharger system. And that's months or years away. Harker paused, choosing his words carefully. But if you fitted a Merlin 61 or 65, two-stage, two-speed supercharging, this aircraft would be extraordinary at all altitudes, possibly better than a Spitfire 9. Campbell Ord raised an eyebrow. That's a bold claim. It's physics. The Mustang has half the drag of a Spitfire thanks to that laminar wing and the radiator design. Put an engine in it that works at altitude, and you've got a fighter that's fast everywhere. With range, the Spitfire can't match. Look at the fuel capacity, 180 gallons internal. A Spitfire carries 90. And where exactly do you propose we find spare Merlin 61 engines? The Air Ministry would have your head on a pike. Harker smiled thinly. Let me worry about the Air Ministry. Back at Hucknall the next day, Harker went straight to Ray Dory's office. Dory headed Rolls-Royce's experimental division, a man who understood both engineering reality and institutional politics. Harker laid out what he'd seen, what he'd felt, what the performance data suggested. The numbers work, Dory said after reviewing Harker's notes, but you're asking to divert Merlins from aircraft that are already in production and desperately needed. I'm asking to create a fighter that could change the entire nature of the air war over Europe. The Americans are losing bombers at unsustainable rates. They need escorts that can go the distance. The Mustang has the range, it just needs the engine to fight when it gets there. Dory drummed his fingers on the desk. Ernest Hives would have to approve this, and he'd need Air Ministry support. You're talking about Air Chief Marshal Freeman's territory? Then that's who we talk to. Within 48 hours, Dory had consulted with Ernest Hives, the head of Rolls-Royce. Hives understood innovation when he saw it. More importantly, he understood that wars were won by being right, not by following established procedures. Authorization came through. Proceed with a proposal. Hives drafted a letter to Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, Air Member for Production and Design. Freeman was one of the few senior officers in the Air Ministry who understood that sometimes the best answer came from unexpected quarters. He'd championed the Spitfire when others doubted. He'd supported the four-engine Lancaster when conventional wisdom said twin-engine bombers were sufficient. On May 13, 1942, Air Ministry representatives and Rolls-Royce engineers met in London. Harker presented his case. The Mustang's exceptional airframe, the Allison's altitude limitations, the transformative potential of Merlin power, projected performance 440 miles per hour at 26,000 feet, combat radius that would dwarf any existing fighter. The resistance came immediately. Merlin production was sacred. Every engine built had a home already assigned. The Spitfire 9 program couldn't be compromised. The Lancaster production was ramping up. Where exactly would these Mustang engines come from? Freeman listened to the arguments, then cut through them with the authority of someone who'd seen too many good ideas strangled by institutional inertia. We'll convert 5 airframes. Experimental program. If Harker's right, we've created something valuable. If he's wrong, we've lost 5 engines and learned something. Proceed. By early June, authorization was official. The Ministry of Aircraft Production's Controller of Research and Development approved Merlin 61 installation in Mustangs at Hucknall. Separately, through General Arnold's office, Packard Motors in America would install their license-built Merlin equivalent in U.S.-based Mustangs. 4 Mustang MKY airframes arrived at Hucknall: AM-203, AM-208, AL-963, and AL-975. A fifth A-518 would be used for installation studies. The designation was settled. Mustang X, experimental, unproven, a gamble that Britain's most valuable engine could redeem an American orphan fighter. The engineering challenges were immediate and complex. The Merlin 61 was larger than the Allison. The two-stage supercharger required intercooling, which meant additional radiators. The cooling system had to be redesigned. The engine mounts needed modification. The propeller had to change. 4-bladed Rotoll instead of the Allison's 3-blader. We told Challier, Rolls-Royce's chief aerodynamic engineer at Hucknall, ran calculations on the radiator modifications. The intercooler radiator initially went in a separate intake beneath the engine, giving the modified Mustangs a distinctive chin that would become iconic. Later refinements relocated the intercooler to the main ventral radiator duct, creating a sleeker profile. The first conversion, AL-975, flew on October the 13th, 1942. Captain R.T. Shepard, Rolls-Royce's chief test pilot, took the controls. Harker stood on the tarmac at Hucknall, watching the modified Mustang climb away into autumn's sky. Shepard landed 20 minutes later, with a grin splitting his face. "Ronnie, you magnificent bastard. It's everything you said it would be, better, even." The performance trials confirmed what Harker had predicted. At 22,000 feet, the Mustang X hit 422 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet, over 430. The service ceiling stretched to 40,600 feet, altitude where the Allison-powered version could barely wheeze. Climb rate doubled. Acceleration was savage. The combination of the Mustang's low-drag airframe and the Merlin's high-altitude power created something that exceeded the sum of its parts. Word spread through the RAF like wildfire, through the USAAF units in Britain like lightning. Freeman ensured that 2 of the converted Mustang X's were loaned to the American 8th Air Force at Bovingdon for evaluation. American pilots flew them and reported back to Washington with something approaching religious fervor. This was it. This was the answer. But Britain couldn't exploit it. Rolls-Royce's production was locked into existing contracts. Converting the RAF's Allison Mustangs would require engines that didn't exist, production capacity that wasn't available. The RAF wanted 1,000 Merlin Mustangs. They would eventually receive only 25. America, however, had no such constraints. Packard Motors in Detroit was already building Merlins under license. Production capacity could be expanded. North American Aviation could modify the production line. The pieces were in place for mass production if someone in Washington would commit that someone was already working the problem. Thomas Hitchcock bouncing between London and Washington, flooding reports and performance data to anyone who would listen, hosting dinner parties for influential friends, calling in favors from his polo playing days and his banking connections. In California, Edgar Schmued received drawings of the Merlin installation from Rolls-Royce. North American began their own modifications. In July 1942, working with Merlin's 65 engines sent from England and 2 P-51A airframes pulled from production. The designation XP-78 was briefly assigned, then changed to XP-51B. The American program proceeded in parallel with the British effort, engineers on both sides of the Atlantic, working toward the same goal. In August 1942, before the first American Merlin Mustang had flown, the USAAF ordered 400 P-51Bs. It was a bet, a gamble, a commitment based on British test data and American faith that the combination would work as advertised. On November 30th, 1942, North American test pilot Bob Chilton lifted the first XP-51B into California sky. The Packard V1653 engine, American-built Merlin, roared with 2,400 horsepower. Performance exceeded engineering estimates. At 29,800 feet, the XP-51B hit 440 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version at that altitude. The USAAF had their escort fighter. They just didn't have enough of them yet. Back at Hucknall, Ronald Harker filed his reports and moved on to other projects, converting Vulture-engined Manchester bombers to 4 Merlin Lancasters, testing supercharger improvements for Spitfires, the 1,000 small engineering battles that defined wartime aviation development. But the Mustang conversion remained his defining achievement. That 30-minute flight at Duxford in April 1942. The immediate recognition that the solution was obvious if anyone had the courage to implement it, the bureaucratic battles to make it happen. He'd seen what others had missed, that sometimes the best solution came from crossing boundaries, from taking a British engine and an American airframe and creating something better than either nation could have built alone. The Mustang X conversions sat at Hucknall and Bovingdon, proof-of-concept aircraft that had served their purpose. Production was ramping up in California and Dallas. By early 1943, P-51Bs would start reaching operational squadrons. By 1944, they would dominate the skies over Europe. But in April 1942, none of that was certain. In April 1942, it was just a test pilot climbing out of an American fighter, standing on British concrete and telling anyone who would listen that he'd found an answer to a question the bomber crews were asking with their lives. The engine was wrong. The airframe was right. Fix one, save the other. Sometimes the solution was that simple if you had the vision to see it and the stubbornness to make it happen. Harker would later say that his 30-minute flight in the Allison Mustang was the most consequential half-hour of his career. He'd flown hundreds of aircraft types, tested countless modifications, solved innumerable engineering problems, but only once did he climb out of a cockpit knowing he'd just seen the future of air combat, waiting only for the right heart transplant to become reality. The orphan plane had found its champion in Washington. Now it had found its solution in Hucknall. All that remained was convincing the machinery of war production to build it in numbers large enough to matter. The dice were still rolling, but the odds were shifting. Schweinfurt, Germany. The briefing room at Chelveston fell silent when Captain Lewis pulled back the curtain. A red line stretched from Cambridge across the English Channel, through occupied France deep into Germany, ending at a city most of the assembled air crews had never heard of. Schweinfurt. Ball-bearing factories, strategic target, essential to German war production. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses would make the run. The escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts, with drop tanks, would take them as far as the German border, maybe a bit beyond if fuel held out. Then the fighters would have to turn back, leaving the bombers alone for the deepest penetration into the Reich. In the back row, 20-year-old waist gunner Thomas Therrien calculated the odds silently. This was his 15th mission with the 305th Bomb Group. The statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. At current loss rates, bomber crews wouldn't survive their required 25 missions. The math was brutal and simple. The briefing officer's voice cut through the murmur. Intelligence estimates moderate fighter opposition. Flak will be heavy over the target. Expected losses 5 to 8%. Someone laughed, bitter and short. Everyone in the room knew intelligence estimates were optimistic. Fiction. The Luftwaffe had been increasing in strength, not decreasing. German pilots had learned to wait just beyond escort range, then hit the bomber formations with everything they had. October 14th, 1943. The date would be remembered. They just didn't know it yet. At Polebrook, First Lieutenant David Palmer ran through pre-flight checks on the Duchess, his B-17. Number 3 engine had been temperamental yesterday, but the ground crew swore they'd fixed it. Palmer trusted his crew chief's word more than he trusted intelligence estimates. The chief had kept them flying through worse. 25 missions. That was the ticket home. Palmer had logged 20 so far, 5 more and he'd be done. 5 more times climbing into a fortress and flying into Germany's industrial heart, while fighters and flak tried to knock him out of the sky. 5 more times watching other B-17s disintegrate in flames, parachutes blossoming white against smoke. The mathematics of survival were grim. Each mission was a coin flip with loaded odds. Do it 25 times and hope the law of averages doesn't catch up. Some crews made it, most didn't. Palmer carried 5 American dimes in his pocket for luck, had carried them on every mission. The superstition was ridiculous, but he couldn't stop. Luck was a commodity in short supply at 25,000 feet over Germany. The B-17s lifted off in waves starting before dawn. The assembly was chaotic as always. Hundreds of bombers circling, finding their formations, joining into the combat boxes that were supposed to provide mutual defensive fire. The theory was elegant. Pack the bombers tight enough that their combined firepower, 13 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, would shred any fighter foolish enough to attack. The theory had stopped working months ago. The Luftwaffe had adapted. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, closing at combined speeds of over 500 miles per hour, firing cannons and rockets before the bombers' guns could track. Twin-engine Messerschmitt 110s and Junkers 88s standing off at 3,000 yards, launching unguided rockets into the formations, anything to break up the boxes, isolate individual bombers, create chaos. The P-47 Thunderbolts appeared as scheduled, sleek and reassuring, weaving above the bomber stream. Their pilots were good, aggressive, dedicated, but they were flying gas tanks with wings. Even with drop tanks, the P-47s had perhaps 90 minutes of escort time deep into enemy territory. Not nearly enough. Over the Dutch coast, the Spitfires that had escorted the first leg wagged their wings and turned for home. The Thunderbolts pushed further, their pilots nursing fuel, calculating ranges, hoping to provide just a few more minutes of coverage. Then, one by one, the P-47s broke away. Fuel warning lights, the arithmetic of distance and gasoline. They'd stretched it as far as physics allowed. The bomber crews watched their little friends disappear, and suddenly the sky felt very large and very empty. The Luftwaffe struck within minutes. Messerschmitt 109s appeared from high and ahead, diving through the bomber formation with guns blazing. The B-17's defensive fire filled the sky with tracers, but the German fighters were through the formation before gunners could track them properly. Then they were climbing away, setting up for another pass. Focke-Wulf 190s hit from the sides, rolling through the formations with cannons firing. A B-17 in the 305th formation took cannon fire in the wing route. The fuel tanks exploded. The bomber cart-wheeled out of formation, trailing fire. Therian saw 3 parachutes deploy before the fortress disappeared into clouds below. 7 men who didn't get out. The intercom crackled with voices. Bandits 3 o'clock high. Fighters 6 o'clock level. Hey, fire, fire, fire. The radio discipline drilled into crews at training evaporated under the reality of combat. Everyone shouted everything. The chaos was absolute. The Duchess shuddered as flak burst nearby. Palmer fought the controls, holding formation, trying to keep the aircraft steady for the bombardier. Number 3 engine was running rough again, despite the ground crew's promises. The oil temperature gauge was climbing into the red. Not now. Not here. Not yet. A twin-engine Junkers 88 appeared off the left, standing off at impossible range. Something detached from under its wings, rockets. The Germans had started using unguided air-to-air rockets, launching them into the tight bomber formations where even a near miss could shred a B-17's thin aluminum skin. The rockets corkscrewed through the formation, one passed between 2 bombers, missing both. Another detonated 50 feet from Palmer's ship, the shrapnel raking the fuselage. The waist gunner called out damage. Non-critical. Keep flying. Bomber after bomber fell away from the formation, some with engines smoking, some with wings shredded, some simply disintegrating under concentrated fire. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything at them. Single-engine fighters, twin-engine heavy fighters, rockets, concentrated cannon fire. The 306th Bomb Group, flying ahead of Palmer's group, was being decimated. B-17s fell in 1s and 2s, their formations breaking apart under the onslaught. 100 men in that group alone would be lost before the day ended. 35 dead or dying, 65 captured after parachuting into enemy territory. Therian's B-17, lagging behind the 305th formation with mechanical issues, became a target of opportunity. A Messerschmitt 109 made a beam attack, cannon fire, walking across the bomber's fuselage. The intercom went dead. In the waist, Lauren Fink, the other waist gunner, collapsed with wounds. Therian kept firing, swinging his 50 caliber, trying to track the fighter as it flashed past. Another fighter, another burst. The B-17 shuddered. More damage. They were falling further behind the formation now, isolated, vulnerable. The worst place to be. The fighter attacks continued all the way to the initial point. Then suddenly, they ceased. The Luftwaffe pilots had expended their ammunition, burned their fuel, making multiple attack runs. They broke away, heading for their bases to rearm and refuel, ready to hit the bombers on the return leg. The flak took over. Schweinfurt's anti-aircraft batteries opened up, filling the sky with black bursts. Palmer held the Duchess straight and level despite the rough number. 3-engine despite the flak, despite everything. The bombardier needed a stable platform, bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward, relieved of its bomb load's weight. Number 3 engine quit completely. Fire warning light. Palmer hit the extinguisher, feathered the prop. The engine nacelle was streaming smoke, but not flames. They could fly on 3 engines. They had to fly on 3 engines because the alternative was bailing out over Germany, and Palmer had no interest in spending the rest of the war in a POW camp. The return journey was worse than the inbound leg. The Luftwaffe fighters were back, rearmed, refueled, and angry. They hit the scattered, battered formations with renewed fury. B-17s that had survived the inbound run disintegrated on the way home. Crews that had thought they'd made it fell burning from German skies. Therion's damaged bomber, limping along far behind the main formation, attracted fighters like the sharks to blood. The pilot tried everything, evasive maneuvers, altitude changes, prayers. Nothing worked. More cannon hits, more damage. The radio operator wounded. 1 engine smoking. At the German border, new P-47s appeared, racing out to meet the survivors. But for Therion's bomber, it was too late. A final attack from a Messerschmitt 109 hit something critical. The pilot gave the order to bail out. Therion pulled his ripcord at 3,000 feet, felt the parachute deploy, and watched his B-17 spiral away, trailing smoke. He counted parachutes. 7. 3 men hadn't made it out. He landed in a plowed field and was captured within the hour. He'd spend the rest of the war in Stalag Luftwaffe, along with 65 other men from the 306th Bomb Group captured that day. Palmer nursed the Duchess back to Polebrook on 3 engines and determination. The landing was rough but successful. He shut down the remaining engines and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking from adrenaline. His crew chief appeared at the cockpit window, face white, staring at the damage. "Jesus Christ, Lieutenant, how'd you get her home?" Palmer climbed out without answering. Around the airfield, crews were landing, counting empty hard stands, realizing the scale of the disaster. The 305th Bomb Group launched 13 bombers that morning. 3 returned, 130 men lost, highest casualty rate of any group in the mission. The final tally came in through the evening. Of 291 B-17s launched, 60 were shot down over Germany. Another 17 were so heavily damaged they'd never fly again, scrapped where they landed. Another 121 had varying degrees of battle damage, loss rate over 26% of the attacking force. 600 men, 600 American airmen in one day, 54 killed, wounded, or missing from crews that made it back. 594 listed as missing in action, dead, and crash bombers or prisoners in German camps. The bomber crews called it Black Thursday. The official history would later note, the fact was that the 8th Air Force had for the time being lost air superiority over Germany. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold received the casualty reports and realized what the crews had known for months. The doctrine of the self-defending bomber was a lie. B-17s bristling with 50 caliber guns couldn't protect themselves against determined fighter attack. The Norden bomb site's supposed precision meant nothing if the bombers couldn't reach the target. All the strategic bombing theory, all the pre-war confidence, all the belief in American technological superiority, none of it mattered without fighter escort that could go the distance. For the remainder of 1943, deep penetrations into Germany were suspended. The 8th Air Force limited its missions to France, the Low Countries, the Ruhr Valley, anywhere fighter escorts could provide continuous coverage. The strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to cripple German industry had reached its breaking point. At Wright Field, in conference rooms at the Pentagon, in air bases across England, the question became urgent. Where were the long-range fighters? Where were the escorts that could take bombers to Berlin and back? The P-47 Thunderbolt, magnificent though it was, couldn't fly far enough. The P-38 Lightning had the range but was in short supply and had its own problems. The P-51 Mustang existed in experimental forms and small production runs, but Arnold had been reluctant to commit fully to a fighter with a British engine in an American airframe. Black Thursday changed the calculus. Pride mattered less than bomber crews coming home alive. Made in America purity mattered less than air superiority over Germany. The elegant theories about unescorted bombers mattered not at all against the brutal arithmetic of loss rates that would consume the entire 8th Air Force within months. Thomas Hitchcock's frantic advocacy suddenly made sense. Edgar Schmued's beautiful airframe suddenly had urgency. Ronald Harker's insistence on the Merlin engine suddenly seemed prophetic. The pieces were all there. Production was ramping up. The P-51B would reach operational squadrons in early 1944. But for the crews flying in October 1943, that was cold comfort. They climbed into their fortresses knowing the odds. They flew the missions because orders were orders, because their country asked it, because someone had to do it, and they died at rates that would have been considered intolerable in any previous war. David Palmer finished his 25th mission in November and rotated home. He kept his 5 dimes and never flew in combat again. When reporters asked about his most memorable mission, he said, Schweinfurt, without hesitation. It was plenty hot, and don't let anyone tell you those German fighters aren't good. They're too darn good. Thomas Therian spent the rest of the war behind wire, one of thousands of American airmen who'd survived combat only to endure captivity. He'd be liberated in 1945, return home, and spend decades trying not to think about the day his bomber fell burning from German skies. The 305th Bomb Group would rebuild. New crews would arrive. New B-17s would replace the ones lost. The missions would continue. But something had broken on Black Thursday, some illusion of invulnerability, some faith that doctrine could overcome reality. The bomber crews needed fighter escorts, escorts that could stay with them all the way to the target, all the way back, escorts that could fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms at bomber altitudes, escorts with the range to reach Berlin and the performance to dominate German fighters when they got there. The Mustang could do it. Everyone knew the Mustang could do it. The British test data proved it. The American performance trials confirmed it. All that remained was building enough of them and getting them to England before the bomber offensive collapsed completely. In California and Dallas, production lines worked around the clock. In Detroit, Packard built Merlin engines by the thousands. In England, fighter squadrons prepared to convert to the new type. In Washington, Arnold finally committed fully to the program that Hitchcock had been championing for over a year. The orphan fighter was coming home, but for 600 men who flew to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, it was coming too late. Black Thursday wasn't the end of the daylight bombing campaign, but it was the end of the illusion that bombers could survive without escorts. It was the end of the doctrine that had sent thousands of young men into German skies in aircraft that couldn't defend themselves. And it was the beginning of the desperate urgency that would finally push the P-51 Mustang from promising experimental fighter to war-winning necessity. The price of that lesson was written in blood over the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt. 600 men in one day. The most expensive education in air-power doctrine ever purchased. The Mustang was coming, but first, someone had to learn why it was needed. Black Thursday was that lesson, delivered with brutal clarity at 25,000 feet over Germany. The alarm clock's rattle cut through the darkness at 0345 hours. Second Lieutenant James Goodson slapped it silent and lay still for a moment, feeling the cold seep through the wool blankets. And outside his Nissen hut at Debden, February rain drummed against corrugated metal with the persistence of artillery fire. England in winter, eternal damp, eternal cold, eternal gray. He swung his legs out of bed, feet hitting bare concrete, and reached for the cigarettes on the footlocker. First smoke of the day, the ritual that separated sleep from whatever came next. Around him in the darkness, other pilots stirred, coughs, groans, the scratch of matches. No one spoke. At this hour before the mission briefing, words felt like wasted energy. The 4th Fighter Group, the Eagles, former RAF volunteers who transferred to the USAAF when America entered the war, had converted to P-51Bs in March 1944. Goodson had mixed feelings about giving up his Thunderbolt. The P-47 was a tank, forgiving, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. You could bring a shot-up jug home on a prayer and duct tape. The Mustang was different. Lighter, faster, more delicate. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine was vulnerable in ways the P-47's radial wasn't. One stray bullet through the coolant system, and you had perhaps 90 seconds before the engine seized. Then you were gliding, looking for somewhere to put down, hoping you were over friendly territory. But the range, Jesus Christ, the range. With two 108-gallon drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and beyond. 5 hours in the air, nearly 600 miles deep into Germany, combat at the destination, fighting on the way home, still landing with fuel to spare. No other fighter in the world could do that, not the Spitfire, not the P-47, not even the twin-engine P-38. The Mustang had turned the impossible into routine. The mess hall served powdered eggs, toast, and coffee that tasted like burned motor oil. Goodson ate mechanically, forcing calories down. 5 hours in a cramped cockpit at altitude demanded fuel, even if the food was barely edible. Around him, pilots ate in silence or made dark jokes about the mission ahead, gallows humor. The pressure valve that kept terror from becoming paralysis. The briefing room at 500 hours. 200 pilots crammed onto wooden benches, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Major Don Blakesley, the group commander, pulled back the curtain covering the wall map. The ribbon stretched from Debden across the Channel, through France, across the Ruhr Valley, deep into Germany, ending at a city everyone recognized, Berlin. Someone whistled, low and appreciative. Berlin. The Big B, the ultimate target. The city Hitler had promised would never be bombed. The Americans had tried 3 times in early March, losing bombers at rates that made even hardened crews blanch. Now they were going back. "We're escorting the 1st Bombardment Division," Blakesley said, his voice flat matter-of-fact. 662 B-17s hitting industrial targets in the capital. The Luftwaffe will throw everything they have at us. Intelligence estimates 200 to 300 German fighters. Expect coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The weather officer stood up. Cloud cover over the Channel and northern. France should clear over Germany. Temperatures at altitude will be minus 60 Celsius. Check your oxygen systems. Check them twice. Minus 60 Celsius, 136 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Cold that would kill exposed flesh in seconds. Cold that turned metal brittle, made guns jam, froze saliva and oxygen masks. The P-51's cockpit heater was adequate at best. Pilots would fly in electrically heated suits, fleece-lined boots, silk glove liners under leather gauntlets, 5 hours dressed like an Arctic explorer, crammed into a space barely larger than a phone booth. The intelligence officer detailed the fighter opposition, Messerschmitt 109s, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, continually improved, still dangerous in skilled hands. Focke-Wulf 190s, radial engine brutes with devastating firepower and roll rates that could scissor through bomber formations. Twin-engine destroyers, Me-410s and Ju-88s, carrying heavy cannons and rockets for standoff attacks against the bombers. The Germans have been concentrating their fighter forces for defense of the Reich, the intelligence officer continued. They're pulling units from France, from Italy, from the Eastern Front. Everything is being funneled into defending German industry. Expect experienced pilots. Expect aggressive tactics. Expect them to press attacks even when we're shooting at them. Goodson studied the map. 590 miles from Debden to Berlin. Call it 4 hours and 45 minutes flight time with combat. Add 15 minutes for assembly over England. 5 hours total, maybe a bit more. The P-51B's internal fuel capacity was 184 gallons. With two 108-gallon drop tanks, total capacity jumped to 400 gallons. The Merlin burned approximately 80 gallons per hour at cruise power settings. 5 hours meant 400 gallons consumed, landing on fumes, but it was doable. That was the miracle. What had been mathematically impossible 6 months ago was now simply difficult. The operations officer covered formation positions, radio frequencies, rendezvous points, emergency procedures. You got separated from the formation, stay high, stay fast, head west. Don't try to be a hero. A lone P-51 was a target of opportunity for every German fighter within 50 miles. If you had to bail out over Germany, destroy the aircraft if possible, evade east toward Russian lines if you're that deep, west toward Allied lines if not, expect no help. You're on your own. Blakesley's final words. The bombers are counting on us. Stick close, watch each other's tails. If you see a Hun, kill him. If you get in trouble, call it out. We bring everyone home. Questions? Silence. Synchronize watches. Engines start at 6:15. We're wheels up at 6:30. Good hunting, gentlemen. The ritual of preparation occupied the next hour. Goodson collected his gear from his locker. Parachute, Mae West life vest, survival kit, escape maps printed on silk, concentrated food bars that tasted like sweetened sawdust, water bottle, bonsoir fiba de $1 .145 caliber pistol with 2 magazines. The pistol was optimism. If you were shot down over Germany, a handgun was theatrical prop, more than practical tool, but regulations required it, so everyone carried one. The equipment room issued electrically heated suits. Goodson plugged his in to test it. Warmth spread across his chest and down his legs. The suit would connect to the aircraft's electrical system, drawing power to keep hypothermia at bay. If the electrical system failed, the suit became useless insulation. If the suit's wiring short-circuited, you could be electrocuted in the cockpit. Nothing about high-altitude combat was without risk. Walking to the flight line in pre-dawn darkness, Goodson could hear the bomber formations assembling overhead. Hundreds of radial engines, a sound like distant thunder that never stopped. The B-17s would be circling, finding their groups, stacking into combat boxes. Tiny colored flares arced through the clouds, identification signals, assembly markers, controlled chaos that somehow coalesced into formations capable of defending themselves through sheer volume of overlapping firepower. His P-51B sat on the hard stand, christened Blondie after his wife. The crew chief, Sergeant Micah Gladych, stood beside it, smoking. Gladych was Polish, had escaped when Germany invaded, worked his way to England, and somehow ended up maintaining American fighters. He knew the Merlin engine better than most Rolls-Royce engineers. When Gladych said an aircraft was ready, it was ready. How's she looking, Mike? Perfect, Lieutenant. Topped off the tanks. Check the guns. Drop tanks are full. She'll get you there and back. Goodson did his own pre-flight, circling the aircraft, checking control surfaces, peering into the air intake, inspecting the tires. Pilots who skipped pre-flight didn't last long. Trust but verify. The ground crew wanted you to come back as much as you wanted to come back. Climbing into the cockpit was a practiced contortion. Step on the wing root, slide into the seat, plug in oxygen, plug in radio, plug in heated suit, strap in with shoulder harness and lap belt, adjust rudder pedals, check stick movement. The P-51's cockpit was tight, efficient, everything within reach. The instrument panel displayed airspeed, altitude, heading, fuel quantity, engine temperatures, oil pressure. The gun sight, a simple ring and bead for the B model. Later versions would get the gyroscopic K-14, sat on the windscreen centerline. Engine start. The Packard Merlin turned over, coughed, caught, settled into a deep rumble that Goodson felt through the airframe. Instruments came alive, oil pressure rising, coolant temperature climbing, 1,200 horsepower waiting for the throttle. He ran through the checklist, tested the magnetos, checked control surfaces, verified radio communication. Horseback leader, this is horseback Blue 3, radio check. Blue 3, horseback leader, loud and clear. Around him, 47 other P-51s fired up, the sound building to a sustained roar. Debden's runways had seen Spitfires and Hurricanes in 1940, P-47 Thunderbolts until 2 months ago, now Mustangs. The aircraft changed, but the mission remained constant. Protect the bombers, destroy German fighters, own the sky. Wheels up at 6:30, climbing into gray overcast. Goodson stayed tight in formation, references to the other aircraft more reliable than instruments in the cloud. At 15,000 feet, they broke into clear air, the sunrise painting eastern clouds in shades of orange and pink. Below, England disappeared under solid overcast. Above, open sky and vapor trails from bombers already at altitude. The rendezvous point was over the channel. Goodson scanned the sky, watching for the bomber stream. There, dark specks against high clouds, growing into the distinctive silhouettes of B-17 flying fortresses. Hundreds of them stacked in combat boxes, each box offset vertically and horizontally for maximum defensive firepower. The formation stretched for miles, a river of aluminum and determination. The P-51s took position above and ahead of the bombers, primary responsibility. Intercept German fighters before they reached the vulnerable fortresses. Secondary, stick close enough to break up attacks that penetrated the screen. The bomber crews called the fighters little friends. The fighter pilots called the bombers big friends. Mutual dependence, mutual respect. Crossing the enemy coast brought the first test. German radar tracked the formation. Fighter controllers on the ground scrambled interceptors. The Luftwaffe had learned hard lessons about attacking through thick fighter escort. They tried to split the escort, draw some P-51s away with feints, then hit the bombers with everything else. Blakesley's voice on the radio. Horseback leader to all flights bandits, 10 o'clock high, Angels 27, looks like 109s. Blue and red flights, take them. Green and white, stay with the bombers. Goodson, flying in blue flight, broke left and climbed. The Messerschmitts were diving from altitude, a classic bounce attempt. 8 of them, maybe 10, hard to count with the sun behind them. The P-51 responded to control inputs with crisp precision, climbing at full military power. The Merlin howling. Combat at altitude was different from ground-level dogfighting. Everything happened slower because the air was thinner. Turns were wider. Climbs were more gradual. Stalls came earlier because there was less air to bite, but speeds were higher. Closing rates could exceed 600 miles per hour. Decisions had to be made in fractions of seconds. The 109 saw the P-51s coming and split, half continuing toward the bombers, half turning to engage. Goodson picked a target, a 109 painted in mottled gray and green camouflage, and worked to get behind him. The German pilot was good, jerking his fighter through violent maneuvers, trying to spoil Goodson's tracking. The Mustang stayed with him. Tighter turn radius than the 109 at this altitude. Better acceleration. Goodson waited until the range closed to 300 yards, centered the Pipper on the 109's fuselage, and squeezed the trigger. All 650 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously. The recoil was noticeable, the aircraft shuddering slightly. Tracers arced out. Every fifth round was a tracer, painting red-orange lines through the air. Hits sparkled on the 109's wing and engine. Pieces flew off. Smoke streamed. The German fighter rolled inverted and dove, trailing a stream of coolant or fuel. Goodson didn't follow. The cardinal sin was pursuing a damaged aircraft while other threats remained. His wingman, Lieutenant Robert Wehrman, called out another 109 at 3 o'clock. They turned together, working as a pair, the way training had drilled into them until it became instinct. The air battle dissolved into the chaos that characterized all fighter combat. Individual duels, quick shots, aircraft flashing past in microseconds. Radio discipline collapsed, everyone shouting positions, warnings, claiming kills. The bombers pressed on, their formations tightening as damaged aircraft struggled to maintain position. After 15 minutes, the Germans broke off. Low on fuel or ammunition, they dove away toward airfields below. Goodson checked his own fuel. One drop tank was empty, transferred dry. He salvoed it, felt the aircraft lurch as 300 pounds of empty metal fell away. The second drop tank still showed half full. Internal tanks at 3/4, good enough. They were barely halfway to Berlin. The German fighters came in waves. Over the Ruhr Valley, Focke-Wulf 190s attacked from below, climbing vertically through the bomber formations before rolling away. At the German border, twin-engine Me-410s tried standoff rocket attacks, launching unguided projectiles from 2,000 yards. Blakesley led the P-51s through the attackers like a scythe, breaking up formations, forcing the Germans to jettison their heavy ordnance and fight. Inside his cockpit, Goodson fought the cold and fatigue. 3 hours into the mission now. His feet were numb despite the heated suit. His oxygen mask was frosted with frozen condensation. His fingers were stiff inside the leather gloves. The windscreen had ice crystals forming at the edges where the defroster couldn't reach. He shifted position constantly, trying to maintain circulation, fighting the urge to just sit still and endure. This was the reality, a long-range escort that briefing rooms never captured. Not just the combat, but the grinding physical endurance test. 5 hours in freezing temperatures. 5 hours breathing pure oxygen through a rubber mask. 5 hours of constant alertness, because letting your attention waver for 10 seconds could get you killed. 5 hours unable to stand, stretch, or relieve yourself. The bombers reached Berlin at 1100 hours. The flak was intense, black puffs filling the sky at bomber altitude. The B-17s pressed through it, bomb bay doors opening. Goodson watched from 10,000 feet above as the lead aircraft released, others following in sequence. Bombs tumbled away, falling toward targets he couldn't see through haze and smoke. German fighters swarmed like hornets. They'd been holding back, conserving fuel, waiting for this moment. The P-51s dove to meet them, turning the sky over Berlin into a sprawling air battle that stretched for 50 miles. Goodson shot at a 109, missed, evaded a Focke-Wulf that appeared from nowhere. Watched Wehrmann shoot down a 190 that had gotten on another P-51's tail. A B-17 took a direct flak hit. The fortress disintegrated, not burned, not fell, but simply came apart in midair, debris and bodies tumbling through 25,000 feet of cold German sky. Goodson looked away. Nothing to be done. Another fort slid into the gap left by the destroyed bomber, maintaining formation integrity. The bombers turned for home, the P-51s forming up around them for the return leg. More fuel gone. Goodson's second drop tank was empty now. He salvoed it down to internal fuel only. The gauge showed just under half. Enough to make it home if nothing went wrong. If he didn't have to use combat power, if he didn't get separated and have to navigate alone. Fuel was always the limiting factor, the invisible enemy that couldn't be fought. The Germans hit them again over the Ruhr, a last desperate attempt to inflict maximum casualties. The fighter battle had evolved throughout 1944. Early in the year, the Luftwaffe still tried to reach the bombers directly. By now, they'd learned that penetrating the fighter screen was nearly impossible. So they targeted the escorts instead, trying to shoot down P-51s, trying to force them to burn fuel in combat, trying to separate them from the bombers through attrition. It didn't work. There were too many Mustangs. For every P-51 damaged or shot down, 2 more filled the gap. The mathematics of attrition that had devastated bomber crews in 1943 now worked against the Luftwaffe. Germany was running out of experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. Every ace shot down represented thousands of hours of combat experience lost. Crossing back into Allied airspace felt like exhaling after holding your breath. The tension didn't disappear. Combat could still happen. Lone German fighters sometimes pursued this far, but it eased. Goodson's fuel gauge showed 1/4 full. Enough. He'd make it. Debden appeared through thinning clouds at 15-20 hours. 4 hours and 50 minutes since takeoff. Goodson joined the landing pattern, dropped gear and flaps, touched down with a chirp of rubber on concrete. He taxied to the hard stand, shut down the Merlin, and sat motionless for a moment in the sudden silence. His hands shook. Adrenaline after effect. His body ached from 5 hours of immobility and tension. His bladder screamed. His face was creased with lines from the oxygen mask. He could smell himself. Sweat and fear and cigarette smoke soaked into every layer of clothing. Sergeant Gladych appeared at the wing. "How'd she run, Lieutenant?" "Perfect, Mike. She got me there and back. That's all I ask." Goodson climbed out stiffly, his legs barely supporting him. Around the airfield, other P-51s were landing, some smoking, some with battle damage, some trailing fuel or coolant. Debden's intelligence officers would debrief every pilot, documenting every engagement, every claim, every observation, the paperwork of war. The mission result came through during debriefing of 662 B-17s dispatched to Berlin. 8 were lost. 8, less than 2%. A year ago, losses of 20% were common. 6 months ago, 10% was considered acceptable. Now, with long-range fighter escort, the bombers could hit Berlin in daylight and come home. The P-51 had made that possible, not through superiority in any single characteristic. The 109 could outclimb it, the 190 could outroll it, the Spitfire was more maneuverable. But the Mustang's combination of range, altitude, performance, and speed created an asymmetry the Luftwaffe couldn't overcome. German fighters operating near their bases still had to fight P-51s that had flown 500 miles to get there. Goodson would fly 44 more combat missions before the war ended. Some lasted 6 hours. Some involved multiple combats. Some resulted in damaged aircraft and emergency landings. He shot down 14 German aircraft, probably destroyed 2 more, damaged 7. The numbers mattered to the statisticians tracking air superiority, but the real measure wasn't kills. It was bomber crews who came home. It was B-17s that reached their targets and returned without being decimated. It was the steady, grinding attrition of the Luftwaffe's fighter force, losing pilots faster than training could replace them, losing aircraft faster than factories could build them. The P-51 didn't win the air war through dramatic technological superiority. It won through the unglamorous mathematics of range, endurance, and presence, the ability to be there at the target when the bombers needed protection, the ability to fly 4 hours and 55 minutes, fight at the end of that flight, and still make it home. That's what the briefing room charts and performance specifications never captured. The human cost of those 5 hours, the physical endurance required, the mental alertness maintained across hundreds of miles, the trust between pilot and machine, between wingman and leader, between fighter and bomber. 4 hours and 55 minutes, routine, repeatable, sustainable. The Germans couldn't match it. The Messerschmitt 109 had range of maybe 400 miles, the Focke-Wulf 190 less. They fought over their own territory but couldn't stay with American raids from initial crossing to target to return. The P-51 could. That asymmetry, multiplied across hundreds of missions, decided the air war's outcome. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Not because they ran out of aircraft. German factories produced fighters almost until the end. Not because they lacked fuel, though fuel shortages did worsen. They lost because they ran out of pilots capable of flying those aircraft effectively. The P-51 killed the Luftwaffe through exhaustion, attrition, and presence, and it did so 1 5-hour mission at a time, flown by pilots like Goodson, who climbed into cramped cockpits before dawn and returned after dark, cold and exhausted, and still alive. The alarm would ring again tomorrow at 0345. Another mission, another 5 hours, another opportunity to bring the bombers home. That was the job. That was what the orphan fighter had been built to do. And it did the job better than anyone had imagined possible when Edgar Schmued first sketched the design in 1940, 4 hours and 55 minutes, the distance from England to Berlin and back, the measure of range that changed everything. The reason bomber crews called the P-51 pilots their little friends, with genuine gratitude in their voices. The reason Germany lost control of its own skies, and the reason the war ended when it did, how it did. The statistical summary arrived at the Pentagon in July 1945, 2 months after Germany's surrender. 17 pages of tables, charts, and cold arithmetic documenting the air war over Europe. Page 8 contained a single line that told the essential story. P-51 Mustangs destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter type. But in a sub-basement office at Wright Field, a different kind of analysis was taking shape. Captain Richard Morrison, an engineer who'd spent the war evaluating combat loss reports, stared at a chart that troubled him. The P-51 had the highest kill ratio of any American fighter. It also had a vulnerability that rarely appeared in the celebratory press releases, the liquid-cooled engine. Morrison's data showed that roughly 40% of P-51 combat losses resulted from coolant system damage. A single rifle-caliber bullet through the glycol tank, one piece of flak fragment puncturing a coolant line, and the pilot had perhaps 90 seconds before the Merlin seized. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its massive air-cooled radial engine, could absorb dozens of hits and keep flying. The P-51 was a thoroughbred, magnificent when healthy, fragile when wounded. The trade-off had been worth it. Morrison knew that. The streamlined nose that housed the vulnerable liquid cooling system also produced the low drag that gave the Mustang its speed and range. You couldn't have one without the other. But 40% was 40%. Hundreds of pilots had died not because they were outfought, but because a stray round found a coolant line. Perfection always had a price. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland sat in the interrogation room at Kaufering, waiting. The war had been over for 2 months. He'd surrendered to American forces, been processed through the POW system, and now sat answering questions from Allied intelligence officers trying to understand how Germany had lost the air war so completely. The question came from a young American major. When did you realize you'd lost air superiority? Galland, who'd commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces from late 1943 until he was relieved by Goering in early 1945, didn't hesitate. When your Mustangs appeared over Berlin, that was the end. We could still fight, but we could not win, the major pressed. The Me-262 jet fighter was superior to the P-51 in performance. Why didn't it change the outcome? Galland smiled without humor. We had jets. We had good pilots, at least in the beginning. What we didn't have was time. Your P-51s killed us slowly, mission by mission, pilot by pilot. The jets might have won individual battles, but the Mustangs were winning the war of attrition, and in attrition, numbers matter more than technology. The interrogation report, filed and forgotten in archives for decades, captured a truth that the kill ratio statistics obscured. The P-51 didn't win by being invincible. It won by being everywhere, constantly grinding down an enemy that couldn't replace losses as fast as they accumulated. In late 1944, the Luftwaffe was still producing fighters at remarkable rates despite Allied bombing. Messerschmitt factories were dispersed, hidden in forests, buried in hillsides. Production actually increased through early 1945. Germany ended the war with thousands of aircraft that never flew combat missions. The bottleneck wasn't machines, it was men. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler had survived 4 years of air combat, from the Battle of Britain through the defense of the Reich. By December 1944, he was one of the old men, 28 years old, with over 500 combat missions. Most of his original squadron was dead. The replacements arrived younger, less trained, more frightened with each passing month. The training pipeline had collapsed. In 1941, Luftwaffe fighter pilots received over 200 hours of flight training before their first combat mission. By late 1944, replacement pilots arrived at operational squadrons with 50 hours, sometimes less. They didn't know how to formation fly properly. They'd never practiced gunnery against a maneuvering target. Some had barely mastered takeoffs and landings. Stiegler watched them die on their first mission, on their second. The experienced pilots called them cannon fodder. It wasn't cruelty, it was recognition of mathematical reality. A pilot with 50 hours of training facing American pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time and dozens of combat missions didn't have a chance. The only question was how quickly they'd be shot down. The P-51s created this attrition through simple presence. Every bomber raid required fighter escort. Every fighter escort meant the Luftwaffe had to respond or cede German airspace. Every response meant combat. Every combat meant losses. Experienced pilots died. Replacement pilots arrived undertrained, died faster, were replaced by even less capable pilots. The death spiral was irreversible by 1945. Major George Preddy was the top P-51 ace in the European theater with 26.83 confirmed kills when he died on Christmas Day, 1944. Not shot down by a German fighter, not hit by flak. Killed by American anti-aircraft fire from nervous gunners who misidentified his P-51 during a low-altitude chase. His death illustrated another hidden cost of the air campaign. The skies over Europe were lethally crowded. Thousands of aircraft, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, photo survey aircraft, all operating in the same airspace. Friendly fire incidents were common. Mid-air collisions occurred regularly. The chaos of combat led to navigation errors, aircraft lost over the North Sea, pilots who survived their missions but crashed landing in bad weather. The statistics counted these losses the same way they counted aircraft shot down in combat. But they represented a different kind of attrition, the inevitable cost of putting thousands of young men in high-performance aircraft over hostile territory in all weather conditions. Preddy's squadron mates mourned him and continued flying. The missions didn't stop. The war didn't pause. His P-51 was reassigned to another pilot within 48 hours. The machine was more valuable than the man who flew it. Harsh arithmetic, but true. Captain Chuck Yeager survived. He'd been shot down over France in March 1944, evaded capture with French resistance help, made it to Spain, was repatriated to England. Regulations prohibited pilots who'd been shot down from flying combat again. They knew too much about escape and evasion networks, were security risks if captured a second time. Yeager, with connections all the way to General Eisenhower, got the regulation waived. He returned to combat in the fall of 1944, flying P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group. On October 12th, in a massive air battle over Bremen, he shot down 5 German fighters in a single mission. His first kill that day was a Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter caught during landing approach when it was slow and vulnerable. Yeager was talented, aggressive, and exceptionally lucky. He survived to become famous for breaking the sound barrier in 1947. But he knew the truth that the celebratory headlines missed. Survival was mostly luck. Skill mattered, training mattered. But when aircraft were crossing at combined speeds of 600 miles per hour, when a split-second decision meant the difference between shooter and target, luck was the dominant variable. Thousands of pilots just as skilled, just as well-trained, just as aggressive, died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong second. The P-51 gave American pilots an advantage. It didn't make them invincible. The final accounting came slowly. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, attempted to quantify what the air campaign had actually accomplished. The conclusions were sobering and controversial. German industrial production continued increasing until late 1944, despite years of bombing. The vaunted precision daylight bombing campaign hadn't crippled German war production the way pre-war doctrine promised. Factories were dispersed. Production moved underground. Workers were impressed from occupied territories. The German war economy was more resilient than planners anticipated, but the survey found something unexpected. The escort campaign, the grinding attrition of fighter combat, had achieved what the bombing campaign struggled to accomplish. By destroying the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot corps, the P-51s had made it impossible for Germany to defend its airspace effectively. By 1945, Allied aircraft operated over Germany with near impunity. That freedom of action, more than any specific bombing target destroyed, had broken German logistics, isolated battlefield units, and made continued resistance impossible. The P-51 hadn't won by destroying factories. It had won by killing the men who could defend them. Edgar Schmued never flew in combat. He spent the war at his drafting table in California, refining the design, troubleshooting production problems, developing improved variants. The P-51D with the bubble canopy and 650 caliber guns. The P-51H lightweight version that arrived too late to see significant combat. The P-51M with different propeller configurations. He read the combat reports. He saw the photographs of battle-damaged aircraft. He studied the loss reports and the maintenance data. Each piece of information fed back into design improvements. Reinforced coolant lines, better cockpit heating, improved gun mechanisms that wouldn't freeze at altitude. The engineering never stopped. The perfect fighter didn't exist. Only the continuous refinement toward perfection, knowing you'd never fully arrive. After the war, Schmued stayed with North American, working on jets. The P-51 design influenced everything that came after: the F.J. Fury, the F-86 Sabre. The lessons learned in creating the Mustang's low-drag airframe translated directly into transonic jet design. The laminar flow wing concept, imperfect in practice but valuable in theory, informed NASA research for decades. Schmued died in 1985 at 86 years old. His obituaries mentioned the Mustang, the successful fighter that helped win the war. They rarely mentioned the cost, the pilots who died in aircraft he'd designed, the engineering compromises that made the P-51 vulnerable as well as capable, the trade-offs inherent in any complex design. Perfection in engineering meant optimization towards specific goals. The P-51 was optimized for range and speed. Those optimizations came with vulnerabilities. You couldn't have the speed without the liquid cooling system. You couldn't have the range without the fuel capacity that made the aircraft dangerous when hit. Every design choice was a bargain with physics, accepting some weaknesses to gain particular strengths. Thomas Hitchcock didn't survive the war. He died in April 1944, killed in a P-51 crash during a test flight from Salisbury, England. The irony was brutal. The man who championed the Mustang, who'd fought through bureaucratic resistance to get it into production, died flying the aircraft he'd advocated for so passionately. The crash investigation found no mechanical failure, no enemy action. Probable cause, pilot error during low-altitude maneuvering and poor visibility. Hitchcock was 44 years old, perhaps not as sharp as the 25-year-old fighter pilots filling operational squadrons. He'd been test flying a new variant, trying to evaluate its handling characteristics, and simply flew into the ground. The man who'd walked 100 miles through German territory in 1918 after jumping from a prisoner train, who'd dominated international polo, who'd refused to accept no from right field procurement officers, died in a field in England because of a moment's inattention. Wars killed people indiscriminately. Combat pilots, test pilots, ferry pilots delivering aircraft to operational units. All faced risks. All made the same bargain. Accept danger in exchange for purpose. The 4th Fighter Group, flying from Debden throughout 1944 and into 1945, accumulated an impressive combat record. Over 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, multiple aces, presidential unit citations. After Germany surrendered, the group redeployed briefly before deactivating. The pilots scattered. Some stayed in the military, transitioning to jets, fighting in Korea. Some left, returning to civilian life, trying to explain to people who'd never been there what it felt like to fight at 500 miles per hour, 25,000 feet above Europe, where the only thing between you and death was training, reflexes, and luck. Many couldn't explain it. The words didn't exist. How do you describe 5 hours in a frozen cockpit hunting other men, being hunted, in return knowing that a single mistake meant dying in a country whose language you didn't speak? How do you convey the strange dichotomy of aerial combat, intimate and impersonal simultaneously? You tried to kill men you couldn't see clearly, whose faces you never learned, whose lives you knew nothing about. Some pilots suffered what would later be called PTSD, nightmares, difficulty readjusting to civilian life, relationships that failed because they'd changed in ways their families couldn't understand. The hidden cost of combat, uncounted in the victory statistics. The P-51s themselves began disappearing shortly after the war. Thousands were scrapped, melted down for their aluminum. Some were sold as surplus to foreign air forces. Israel, South Africa, Sweden, a dozen other nations flew Mustangs through the 1950s and beyond. A few hundred ended up in civilian hands, modified for air racing. The Mustang proved its peacetime value in one final role, air racing, at the Cleveland National Air Races and Reno Air Races. Modified P-51s competed for decades, reaching speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The same low-drag airframe that gave the aircraft its combat range made it a natural racer. The same Merlin engine that powered it to Berlin could be modified to produce over 3,000 horsepower for brief racing sprints. But racing killed pilots too. The modifications pushed the aircraft beyond its design limits. Structural failures occurred, engines seized. Men who'd survived World War II died decades later in aircraft that had been built to fight a war that ended before they were born. In archives and museums, historians began assembling the complete story. Not just the victories, but the failures. Not just the aces, but the pilots who died on their first mission. Not just the technological triumphs, but the compromises and limitations. The P-51 Mustang emerged from this analysis as something more complex than propaganda had suggested. Not an invincible superweapon, but a very good fighter employed in enormous numbers by well-trained pilots against an enemy being ground down by attrition. The statistics told part of the story. 4,150 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 4,131 destroyed on the ground, 15,586 P-51s built in total, 2,520 lost to all causes in combat. The numbers were impressive, but incomplete. They didn't capture the sound of a Merlin engine at full power. The way the aircraft handled at altitude, light and responsive. The confidence pilots felt with dropped tanks full, knowing they could go anywhere and come back. The gratitude of bomber crews watching P-51s weave above them, fighting to keep German fighters away. The numbers didn't show the design elegance, the laminar wing that was supposed to provide perfect airflow, but worked well enough even when perfect was impossible. The radiator placement that turned drag into thrust, the modular construction that made rapid production possible, the engineering decisions that created an aircraft greater than the sum of its parts. And the numbers absolutely didn't show the human cost. The pilots who climbed into P-51 cockpits and never climbed out. The ground crews who maintained the aircraft through English winters working in freezing hangars with inadequate lighting. The factory workers in California and Dallas who built Mustangs for months or years without ever seeing one fly. The price of perfection was paid by thousands of people, most of whose names appeared in no history books, whose contributions went uncelebrated except in unit records and manufacturing statistics. Edgar Schmued's gamble, rejecting the safe P-40 contract to design something new in 102 days, had paid off beyond anyone's predictions. But the payoff came at cost. Ronald Harker's 30-minute test, flight that led to the Merlin conversion, had changed air combat history. But changing history meant thousands of young men died fighting an aircraft that wouldn't have existed without his advocacy. Thomas Hitchcock's bureaucratic battles to force the P-51 into production over Wright Field's resistance had saved bomber crews by the thousands, but Hitchcock himself died flying the aircraft he'd championed. The bomber crews who survived because P-51s escorted them to targets and back went home to families, jobs, lives. They were the ones who didn't die over Schweinfurt or Berlin or any of 100 other targets. Their survival was the victory the P-51 made possible. That was the measure that mattered most. The P-51 Mustang didn't win the war alone. No single weapon system ever does. But it solved a specific problem at a critical moment. It made long-range daylight bombing survivable. That capability, sustained over months of operations, broke the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. That loss of air superiority made the invasion of Europe possible, made the strategic bombing campaign effective, made Germany's continued resistance untenable. The orphan fighter, rejected by its own air force, powered by a British engine designed by an immigrant engineer, championed by a polo player who wouldn't take no for an answer, became the weapon that tilted the air war. Not through overwhelming superiority, through presence, through range, through the ability to be there when needed, day after day, mission after mission, until the enemy simply couldn't contest the sky anymore. The price of that victory was measured in destroyed aircraft, dead pilots, and years of grinding attrition. Perfection in war isn't bloodless. It's simply more efficient at achieving its objective. The P-51 was very efficient indeed. In museums around the world, restored Mustangs sit in climate-controlled hangars, polished to mirror finishes, maintained by volunteers who want the public to see what these aircraft looked like when new. They're beautiful, elegant, powerful even sitting still. The docents tell visitors about the specifications, the range, the speed, the victories. Some mention the Merlin engine's distinctive sound. A few discuss the engineering innovations. Almost none mention the screaming cold at altitude, the fear before every mission, the friends who didn't come back, the compromises that made the aircraft vulnerable even as they made it capable, the fact that for every P-51 pilot who became an ace, 3 others died in aircraft that couldn't protect them from every threat. The restored Mustangs are monuments to victory. They're also monuments to the cost of that victory. Both truths coexist. Both deserve recognition. The orphan fighter saved Europe, but it couldn't save everyone who flew it. That distinction between what the aircraft could do and what it couldn't prevent is the final lesson of the P-51 story. Perfection in engineering created an extraordinary weapon. Perfection in warfare remained, as always, impossible. The best you could hope for was good enough to win at acceptable cost. The P-51 Mustang was good enough, barely, but barely was sufficient. That's the price of perfection, accepting that perfection itself is unattainable and making the best possible bargain with reality instead. The war ended. The aircraft aged. The pilots grew old or died. The factories closed. The statistics were compiled and analyzed and debated. And in all that aftermath, one simple truth remained. When bomber crews needed escort fighters that could take them to Berlin and bring them home, the P-51 Mustang answered that need better than any other aircraft of its era. Not perfectly, but well enough to matter. Well enough to tip the balance. Well enough to help win a war. Sometimes that's all perfection really means. Being good enough when it matters most.